Hello YouTube and welcome to another video. This is going to be part 2 in a 3-part series of skinning the bottom of my X2 in carbon fiber. In the last video I put the carbon fiber on the hull. I stuck it down with some 3M Super 71 spray tack, which is a little bit different procedure than is normally used. And in this video, I'm going to be applying a few coats of epoxy to solidify it down and start building layers. You'll have to watch to the end of this video to see why this wasn't the last video in the series, but it's basically for 2 reasons. One reason you'll see at the end of this video, and the second reason is that I didn't want to make this basically like an hour or an hour and a half long. So with that being said, let's just get into the video. I am getting ready to put the epoxy on this, and I thought I would talk to you guys a little bit about epoxy. So ideally, I would be using a clear epoxy to do this. The epoxy that I'm using is polypoxy, and it is not totally clear. It is a lot clearer than something like West Systems, and I'm sure that it will be okay. I'm going to use it for a couple of reasons. One is that I'm familiar with it. 2 is that I have it, and I have a couple of other epoxies that I don't trust to do this same job. And I've invested a lot of money in epoxy already, so I'm not going to go out and buy a special one for this. I may end up top coating this with a clear epoxy to get some UV resistance. But the stuff that I'm putting on right now, I'll mix it up and I will show you guys. This process I'm hoping goes smoothly. Basically, I'm going to mix up a fairly large amount in a cup and then I'm going to squeegee it onto the surface. Bring it up to 100. Whoa, that happened quick. All right. One thing that I'm going to try to be mindful of, and I'm not sure how much difference this is actually going to make, but when the epoxy actually wets out the cloth, I think it's going to cause the glue to release. So I need to make sure not to be too aggressive when I'm moving the epoxy around. Otherwise, I could end up with cloth that is distorted from me pushing on it too hard. Wow, that's pretty thirsty. You can kind of see the colors starting to pop already. Okay, this is going to take a lot of epoxy. That's probably already half of my epoxy. Wow. I'm going to keep working the same areas until they won't take any more epoxy, just to make sure that it's fully wet out. I might switch to a smaller squeegee once I get into the contoured areas. All right, that is 100 grams of epoxy. gone just like that. So this is gonna take a lot of epoxy. I said 300 grams when I started. Let's see how far off I was. This is gonna take probably closer to 1,000 grams. I decided to come back and update you guys because I got just the bottom section done with 100 grams, so I mixed up 200 grams as my next batch. I've been stirring it for 2 minutes. I'm not going to degas this stuff because degassing it for as long as I did last time, I should say as little time as I did last time, actually just seems to add more bubbles to it. You can see this stuff actually went on without any bubbles. Or less bubbles anyway. The degassing process actually added bubbles to it. So I'm just spreading this over one more time just to make sure that I get really good saturation or really good wet out of this cloth. I think what I'll do is try to focus on getting one side of the hull done, and then I'll switch over to doing the other side. I should also mention on camera that it is currently 3 o'clock. I started at about 2:30, I believe, so just to give myself an idea of how much time I'm spending here. Epoxy update. Another 200 grams mixed up with that last batch. I got all of the chines wet out and right down to this line, so I just need to do this side. I'm going to wet this part out now because I got some that ran down into here and I want to start adding material to that before it starts to gel up too much. So I'm just going to pour a whole bunch in here, pour some on top as well, I guess, and work it in. So that's that. I gotta remember not to set my cup on there because I've set it down in a few different places, including the scale. And if I set it on here now, it's very likely going to leave dirt or something in the surface. So not good. It's going well overall, but as I had suspected / feared, the glue is releasing and relaxing the cloth. And so in a couple of places through here, it's actually trying to bubble up a little bit. So I'm going to have to be very careful. I'm going to have to babysit this as it gels up and keep pushing these spots down. I think I should be able to get it okay. But yeah, a little concerned about that right now, but I'll just have to keep an eye on it and make sure I keep putting it in place without fussing with it too much so that I don't mess up the weave. Just because of the way they weave the material, if you run this way across it, it's a lot safer because you're on top of the threads, you're not catching them. Where if you move sideways like I am now, it's a lot easier to snag a thread. The other thing is that when you move front to back like this, it allows you to put a decent amount of pressure so you can actually push the epoxy into the cloth, but scrape off any excess so you get an appropriate amount of epoxy. The squeegee is very efficient at putting down the epoxy, but it's not very, yeah, the edges can potentially leave large beads of epoxy or ridges of epoxy, and that is not good. That could just cause me to have to do a whole lot of sanding. So what I'm going to do, once I get this all applied, I'm going to go over it with a dry roller and make sure I pick up all of the excess epoxy so that I don't end up with ridges that I need to sand down. Or I'm less likely, or I will have less ridges to sand down. How about that? All right, YouTube, I've now mixed up another 100 grams and I got all of this part wet out. It went fairly well, but I did make a bit of a mistake. I basically forced the cloth in a little bit too aggressively, and I caused it to have a little bit of a wrinkle here. I just caused it to bunch up because I was being too aggressive with it. But all in all, I was able to work it back into place. I don't know if you'll be able to tell when I'm finished what happened. Also, the cloth is relaxing a little bit because of the fact that the glue underneath is letting go. And there are some, oh yeah, you can kind of see here. The same thing that happened along here is happening over there. So I'm going to have to be very careful to come through as this is setting up and make sure that I push all that stuff into place. All right, I've got to be careful not to touch the fibers at the bottom here because I don't want to be picking up fibers and putting them into the outside material. So I'm going to try to do is work it up like this and work my way across. Hopefully this works. In total, it looks like I'm probably going to end up using about 700 grams of epoxy for the initial coat. That's quite a bit considering the fact that this is just a cosmetic layer, and also when you consider that this is just the wet out coat, I'm also going to be painting over this with probably 4 or more coats of epoxy so that I can then wet sand and buff it. And then it's either going to get top coated with a urethane or UV resistant epoxy. I decided to turn on my forced air heater because the floor heating takes a long time to make a temperature difference. It is now cooking in here. I don't know how hot it is, but I'm beginning to sweat quite a bit. I went around the hull with the squeegee and I found a couple of places where there were air pockets. It is extremely important when you're skinning to remove all air pockets. If this stuff isn't in contact with the hull, any little bump is going to cause the surface to break if it's only one layer of carbon supporting itself. So I found that there was a little bit of an air pocket right on the very peak here, and I ended up working that down in through the front and pulling it out. It's getting extremely hot in here now. I'm gonna go clean up my squeegees and maybe watch a couple of YouTube videos, comment on the video that I released today, and have some water. I will be back when this is tacked up and it's time to put more material down. All right, let's spread this stuff around. Well, I think you guys probably get the idea, so I'm not going to film all of this. I got this coat down, I got the heater turned back on, and I am going to set a timer for 2 hours, which means I will be putting my next coat on at 10 o'clock. That means I will be finishing up my next coat around 11 o'clock. It takes about an hour to get a coat of epoxy on. And so that means I won't be able to coat it until tomorrow again. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave the heater on this time to make it cure or tack up quickly. But then overnight I'm actually going to turn the heat off and get it as cool as I can in here so that it slows down, so that when I wake up in the morning it will still be tacky and I can add another coat without worrying about sanding it. For those of you who don't know, epoxy has two types of bonds basically. There is a chemical bond and a physical bond. If you lay up epoxy over already cured epoxy, the only possible attachment or the only possible bond that you can get is a mechanical bond, which means that you have to sand it to allow one material to hook into the other. If you put it down while the other material is still tacky, when it's not fully cured, that means that the material that you put on over the top is able to chemically bond and actually become a part of the existing material. So that's what I'm trying to achieve by leaving it cool in here overnight. Hopefully I can slow down the cure so that when I come back to it tomorrow, I'm putting the material on over a not cured material. Make sense? It is now 10:30 the following morning and I'm about to... It's set up. Okay, so what this means is that I'm going to have to lightly scuff this down before applying another coat, which is going to add some time to the prep work. There are now 2 coats of epoxy over the cloth itself. Unfortunately, this is going to add quite a bit of time to the project overall because it means that I'm going to have to wait about a day for this to fully cure up. I guess even then it won't be fully cured, but I need to wait more time for this to set up more. And the reason for that is that if you try to sand the epoxy when it's a little bit gummy, bits of the sandpaper and bits of the stuff that you've sanded can get driven down into the existing epoxy. And then even after you clean it off and recoat it with epoxy, you will be able to see either those bits in there or the fact that it looks a little bit milky. Sanding the epoxy this time is going to be a bit of a nerve-wracking process because if I sand too deep and actually hit the carbon, it is going to damage the carbon and that will be visible in the finished product. So I need to scuff up the surface enough that the new epoxy will bond to it, but not enough that I actually hit the carbon fiber and damage anything. The last time I checked in with you guys, it was about 10:30 a.m. and it is now a little after midnight, 10:26 a.m. and I spent all day sanding this thing. It unfortunately didn't turn out perfect. I mean, it was never going to be perfect, but I did end up hitting the carbon fiber in quite a few spots. I don't think it's going to be as noticeable as I thought it might be. I can't really show you guys a whole lot until I get it cleaned up and actually probably even put more epoxy on it. Basically what's happening, the green filament that they use in the carbon fiber weave, I'm actually nicking that in some places, and when I do, it's actually sanding the green off of it, and then you can see the little white dots. I did a little bit of trimming and cleanup work off camera. I trimmed around where the bed plate is going to sit, and I also sanded off at the end of the footwells, whatever these are called, just in preparation to put the carbon fiber on over the top. I also cut out the exhaust outlets just because I had the die grinder in hand and I figured I might as well do that. So I got both of the exhaust outlets cut out, as you can see. I know it looks like a little bit of a mess now, but I am still extremely happy with the way this project is going. Keep in mind, this is my first carbon fiber job ever, and it is also my first skinning job ever, and this is a pretty sizable project. I know it looks pretty rough now, but I'm still really happy with the way it's going, and I'm pretty sure that once I get it wetted out with a few more coats of epoxy, that all of you guys will be very pleased with it as well. There is one issue, and that is that I work every day this week, and I pretty much need a full day to be able to get 3 coats on it back to back. What happened here, I shouldn't have had to do this sanding, but I screwed up and I started at 2:30 in the afternoon adding epoxy to the hull. If I would have got up first thing in the morning and started adding epoxy, I would have got all of my coats on before it had cured, and then I would have only had to sand it once and I wouldn't have hit the carbon fiber anywhere. So, lesson learned from that, except probably not lesson learned because I want to get the epoxy done before this weekend. I would like to get this video out to you guys sooner than later, and I would like to be able to move on to something else. Well, that's going to have to do it for this one. As you guys can see, a little bit of a brain fart or a screw up on my part is the reason why this video is taking so long, and also why it would end up being like an hour and a half or 2 hours if I tried to squeeze everything into one video. So this is going to end up being a 3-part series. In my defense, the reason why I thought it was going to take so long to cure is because the first time that I used this epoxy, it actually was still tacky after about 22 hours. I'm pretty sure the difference this time is that not only was the ambient temperature warmer when I was applying the epoxy, but because I turned the heat on in the garage and got it up to about 32 degrees Celsius, even though I opened the windows and cooled it off in here overnight, the hull stayed warm enough that it actually caused the epoxy to cure a lot faster than it had previously. As you guys will see in the next video, it's actually a really good thing that this epoxy set up unexpectedly and I had to sand it down. If you don't pay attention, you might miss the reason as to why this is a good thing, so make sure you keep your eyes and ears open in the next video, and I will try to point it out either in the intro or the outro of the next video, and give you guys a few tips on doing something like this yourself if you ever decide to do it. Anyway, that is going to do it for this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.